My daughter sold the family farm behind my back. She never looked me in the eyes when she made the deal. She raised a glass with her husband while believing I would never learn the truth. By tomorrow, it'll all be over. I heard her whisper with a smile that no longer felt like my little girl's smile. Then, just after the sun disappeared behind the Montana hills, my phone rang. "Mr. Harold Whitmore?" A calm voice asked. "I'm the man buying your farm, and something about this sale doesn't make sense." Those few words stopped my heart. 5 minutes later, a celebration that had begun with laughter was already falling apart, although my daughter and her husband had no idea it had happened. If this story speaks to your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city or country, and let me know your local time as you're listening. I always enjoy seeing how stories like this connect people from different places. Stay with me until the very end because the lesson I learned that night changed the way I looked at family, trust, and the meaning of home forever. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Harold Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and until recently, I believed the strongest thing I had ever built was the family that gathered around my table every Thanksgiving. I was wrong. The strongest thing I had ever built was a stretch of rolling pasture in Madison County, Montana, where the morning fog drifted slowly across 600 acres before the first rays of sunlight touched the old red barn. My late wife, Margaret, and I spent more than 4 decades turning stubborn ground into a place people admired from the highway. Every fence post carried the marks of our hands. Every oak tree reminded me of a season we survived together. After Margaret passed away 6 years earlier, I stayed because leaving that farm would have felt like leaving her behind. Emily, my only daughter, often told people she admired my dedication. "Dad," she would say with a gentle smile, "you've earned some rest. You don't have to work this hard anymore." I always laughed. "This place keeps me alive, sweetheart. As long as I can walk these fields, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She would nod, but sometimes I noticed her husband Jason watching the property instead of listening to our conversation. His eyes lingered on the barns, the grazing cattle, the equipment sheds, and the endless fields beyond them. "Land like this is worth a fortune now," he once said while we stood near the north pasture. "People from everywhere want ranch property." I shrugged. "Maybe they do, but not everything has a price." He smiled politely. "Everyone has a number, Harold." I pretended not to hear the weight behind those words. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't ignored them. The evening everything changed started inside a crowded steakhouse in Bozeman. Emily had insisted we meet there because she said she wanted to celebrate a business milestone. The restaurant buzzed with conversations, clinking glasses, and country music floating softly through the speakers. I arrived wearing the same brown sport coat Margaret used to say made me look respectable. Emily barely glanced at me before returning to her friends. Jason stood near the center of the table with a champagne glass in his hand. "Here's to new beginnings," he announced loudly. Everyone cheered except me because I didn't know what they were celebrating. I smiled anyway. That's what fathers do when they think they're simply out of the loop. A woman across the table looked at me and asked, "Mr. Whitmore, are you excited about finally slowing down?" I frowned. "Slowing down?" Before I could ask another question, Jason laughed. "Harold still doesn't like retirement talk." A few people chuckled. Emily reached over and lightly touched his arm. "He'll come around," she said. Then she looked directly at me. Sometimes people don't realize change is good until it's already happened. Something inside me tightened. I searched her face for the daughter who used to ride horses beside her mother. Instead, I found someone carefully choosing every word. The waitress brought another bottle of champagne. Glasses were raised again. Jason smiled across the room and said, "Tomorrow starts a whole new chapter." I quietly reached for my coffee instead. One of Jason's business friends leaned toward me and asked, "So, what are you planning to do after the sale?" I stared at him. "After what sale?" His smile disappeared. "Oh," I thought. Jason quickly interrupted. "He's joking. Harold loves keeping people guessing." Laughter rolled across the table, but it sounded strangely forced. I felt every eye drift toward me for a brief second before everyone returned to their conversations as though I had become an old man who simply hadn't kept up. No one explained anything. No one asked if I understood. I sat there surrounded by people who talked about my future as if I weren't part of it. I wasn't shouted at. I wasn't insulted outright. Yet I had never felt smaller. I paid for my own dinner, wished everyone a good night, and drove back toward the farm beneath a sky filled with stars. The gravel crunched beneath my truck as I pulled into the driveway. The house stood exactly as Margaret had left it, quiet, familiar, faithful. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was nearly 10 o'clock. The silence felt heavier than usual. Then my phone rang. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Harold Whitmore speaking. A calm man's voice replied, "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm calling because I believe I'm under contract to purchase your family farm." I froze. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "You must have the wrong Harold Whitmore." There was a pause on the other end. Then he answered with quiet certainty. "Sir, that's exactly why I'm calling. I don't think I have the wrong man. I think someone has been hiding the truth from both of us." The line stayed quiet for a moment after Daniel finished speaking, and in that silence I could hear the old grandfather clock in my living room marking another second of a life that suddenly no longer felt familiar. I lowered myself into Margaret's favorite rocking chair without realizing I had done it. "Tell me exactly what you were told," I said. Daniel hesitated, almost as though he regretted making the call. "I do not want to create trouble for your family," he answered. "But I also do not want to buy property from someone who may not have had the authority to sell it." His words settled over me like the first snowfall of winter. Calm, cold, impossible to ignore. "You did the right thing by calling," I replied. "Please start from the beginning." As he explained how he had been introduced to the property through Emily and Jason, my mind drifted somewhere else, not because I was ignoring him, but because memories have a way of arriving all at once when trust begins to crack. I remembered Emily at 8 years old, running through the south pasture with muddy boots that were 3 sizes too big because she insisted on wearing mine. Margaret laughed until tears filled her eyes. "She wants to be just like her father," she said. Emily wrapped both arms around my waist and looked up at me with freckles across her nose. "One day this farm will always be our home, right, Dad?" I smiled and brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "As long as there is breath in my lungs, sweetheart." That promise had never left me. I had built my entire life around keeping it. After Margaret passed away, everything changed in ways I refused to admit. Emily visited less often. At first, she blamed work, then traffic, then meetings. Jason always had another investment to discuss, another opportunity, another market trend. Every visit somehow turned into a conversation about numbers instead of family. "You know, Harold," Jason once told me while leaning against the fence beside the cattle pens, "people are paying unbelievable prices for agricultural land now. You could live comfortably for the rest of your life." I answered without looking away from the herd. "Comfort has never been the reason I stayed here." He laughed politely. "Maybe not. But your daughter deserves to think about her future too." At the time, I believed he was simply being practical. Looking back, I realized he had been measuring every acre long before anyone spoke about selling. There were other moments I ignored because fathers have a dangerous habit of giving their children the benefit of every doubt. Emily asked where I kept old property records. She offered to organize my filing cabinet because she said paperwork stressed me. She suggested adding digital copies of important documents. "You never know when something could happen," she told me. "If there is an emergency, somebody should know where everything is." I thanked her for caring. I never imagined she was quietly learning the map of my entire financial life. One afternoon, she walked through the equipment barn with me while I repaired an old tractor. "Dad," she said carefully, "have you ever thought about creating a trust?" I wiped grease from my hands. Eventually can become too late," she replied. "You should make things easier for everyone." I smiled because she sounded so much like Margaret, always encouraging me to plan ahead. The difference was that Margaret never asked questions with one eye on the answer she wanted. Daniel's voice brought me back to the present. "Mr. Whitmore, I am still here," I answered quietly. "I am listening." Your daughter seemed very confident. Everything appeared legitimate. But there was one thing I could not understand. What was that? Every time I asked to meet the owner personally, there was another excuse. "You were traveling. You were sick. You were unavailable." Then tonight, during dinner with my wife, she asked a simple question. She said, "If this gentleman has owned the ranch for decades, why have you never spoken with him?" I closed my eyes. Margaret used to say that truth often arrives through ordinary people asking ordinary questions. Daniel continued. That question kept bothering me, so I searched for your phone number myself. I stood and slowly walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, moonlight rested gently across the fields. The same fields where Emily learned to ride a horse. The same fields where she once buried a stray kitten with tears streaming down her face because she believed every living thing deserved respect. Somewhere between that little girl and the woman she had become, something had quietly disappeared, and I could not tell whether life had taken it from her or whether she had willingly traded it away. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel said softly, I truly hope there is an innocent explanation. I took a long breath before answering. So do I. But deep inside, another memory surfaced without invitation. About 6 months earlier, I had walked into the farmhouse unexpectedly and heard voices stop the moment I opened the door. Emily quickly folded several papers and slipped them into her purse. Jason smiled too quickly. We were just discussing insurance, he said. Emily added, Nothing important, Dad. I had believed them because believing my own daughter was easier than imagining she could deceive me. Standing there in the quiet farmhouse, I suddenly realized every uncomfortable conversation, every unfinished explanation, every strange glance they exchanged had not been isolated moments. They were pieces of a picture I had refused to assemble. Daniel finally said, I think we should meet tomorrow morning before anyone else knows we spoke. I looked toward the old barn, where a single light still glowed above the entrance exactly as it had every night since Margaret was alive. Yes, I answered. Come to the farm at sunrise. After we ended the call, I remained by the window for a long time. Then I noticed something I had never seen before. The folder where I always kept the original property deed was no longer sitting on the shelf exactly where I had left it. It had been placed back carefully, almost perfectly, but not quite. Someone had opened it, and whoever did it believed I would never notice. The sun had barely climbed above the eastern ridge when I heard tires crunching across the long gravel driveway. Daniel stepped out of a dark pickup truck wearing faded jeans, a work jacket, and the cautious expression of a man who wished he had never become part of someone else's family troubles. We shook hands without saying much. Some mornings are too heavy for unnecessary words. I led him toward the porch where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings watching thunderstorms roll across the valley. He looked across the pasture before speaking. Now, I understand why you never wanted to let this place go. I nodded. This land raised my family as much as I raised them. Daniel reached into a leather folder and carefully spread several documents across the old wooden table. Purchase agreements, survey maps, electronic correspondence, copies of identification. Everything appeared professional at first glance. The names were correct, the acreage matched. The legal descriptions were accurate enough to convince almost anyone. Then he placed one final page in front of me. This is the document that finally made me uncomfortable. I leaned closer. It was a power of attorney bearing my name. My signature sat neatly across the bottom. At first glance, it almost looked authentic. Almost. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly sliding it back toward him. That is not my handwriting. Daniel slowly released the breath he had been holding. I was hoping you would say that. My chest tightened, not because I had confirmed my suspicion, but because someone who knew me well had believed this imitation would fool the world. There were little details no stranger could have invented. The middle initial I always used. The address exactly as it appeared on county records. Even the way the date was written reflected how I usually filled out official paperwork. Whoever prepared it had studied me for years. Daniel looked at me carefully. Who had access to your personal documents? I did not answer immediately. Instead, I remembered Emily standing beside my filing cabinet months earlier. Dad, these old folders are falling apart, she had said with a cheerful smile. Let me organize everything. You have enough to worry about. I remembered thanking her. I remembered making coffee while she stayed alone in my office for nearly an hour. At the time, it had felt like kindness. Now, every memory carried another meaning. My daughter helped me organize paperwork, I finally admitted. Daniel remained silent. He did not rush to conclusions, and I appreciated that. People who work the land learn patience because crops cannot be hurried, and neither can the truth. We spent the next hour comparing dates. Every document traced back to conversations Emily and Jason had been having long before I realized anything was wrong. They had scheduled inspections, shared photographs of the property, negotiated prices, discussed fencing, equipment, water rights, and grazing permits. They spoke with confidence because they believed no one would ever question them. Yet one sentence in an electronic message caught my attention more than anything else. Jason had written, "My father-in-law barely looks at paperwork anymore. Leave everything to us." I read those words 3 times. They were simple, calm, almost casual, but they carried something far heavier than greed. They carried complete certainty that I had already become invisible in my own life. I stood and walked toward the barn. Daniel followed quietly. We stopped beside the weathered oak tree where Margaret and I had buried a small metal box the summer Emily graduated from high school. Inside were family letters, old photographs, and a handwritten note Margaret insisted we save for the future. Emily had been there that day. She had watched her mother seal the box. "Someday," Margaret had said with a smile, "our grandchildren will open this together." Emily had cried because she thought that day was too far away to imagine. I rested my hand against the rough bark of the tree. My wife believed family was something you protected before you protected money. Daniel looked across the pasture. Maybe that is why this hurts so much. Before I could answer, another truck appeared at the entrance to the property. My stomach tightened immediately. Jason climbed out first, carrying the same confident smile I had seen so many times before. Emily followed him, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy morning. They had not expected to find anyone else there. Jason's smile faded for the briefest moment before returning. "Dad," Emily called, forcing warmth into her voice. We were in the area and thought we would stop by. I looked at Daniel, then back at them. "That is thoughtful." Jason extended his hand toward Daniel. "You must be the gentleman interested in the property." Daniel accepted the handshake politely. "Daniel Brooks." Jason's grip tightened slightly. "Good to finally meet you." Emily glanced between us. "Are we interrupting something?" "Just talking," I answered. "About the farm." Jason laughed. "Well, there is not much left to talk about. Everything is moving forward exactly as planned." He spoke with such confidence that I almost wondered whether he believed his own words more than the truth itself. Emily stepped closer to me. "Dad, you really should let us handle complicated business matters. You have carried enough responsibility for one lifetime." I studied her face carefully. She sounded concerned, caring, even. But beneath her gentle voice was something new. It was not love. It was control. She had already begun speaking as though decisions no longer belonged to me. Jason looked around the property with open satisfaction. "This place has tremendous potential once the transition is complete." He pointed toward the north pasture. "That old fence should probably come down first." Then he gestured toward the equipment shed. "The new owners will probably modernize everything." He talked about my home as though I had already disappeared from it. Daniel remained completely silent. He simply observed. Emily noticed the open folder resting on the porch table. Before I could move, she walked over and reached toward it. "Dad, these legal papers can be confusing. Let me take care of them." Her fingers had barely touched the folder when Daniel calmly placed his hand on top of it first. His voice remained polite. "I think Mr. Whitmore would prefer to review them himself." For the first time that morning, Emily's expression changed. It lasted only a second, but I saw it clearly. Surprise, then concern, then something even deeper. Fear. Jason immediately stepped forward. "There is no need to overwhelm Harold with technical paperwork." Daniel met his eyes without raising his voice. "Sometimes the owner deserves to see every page." The silence that followed felt different from any silence we had shared before. Emily slowly withdrew her hand, but not before her eyes landed on one particular document near the top of the stack. I watched the color drain from her face because she recognized it instantly. It was the very document she had believed no one outside her circle would ever see. The wind moved gently across the pasture after Emily pulled her hand away from the folder. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence itself seemed to weigh more than any accusation could have. Jason forced a laugh that sounded far less confident than the one he had arrived with. "I think we are making this much more complicated than it needs to be," he said, slipping both hands into his jacket pockets. "There are always extra documents during transactions like this." Daniel remained calm. "There are," he answered. "That is exactly why every document deserves careful attention." Emily looked toward me instead of Daniel. "Dad, why are we even discussing paperwork with someone who is not our attorney?" Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but I noticed she never once asked what documents we had actually reviewed. She already knew. Before I could answer, another vehicle slowly entered the driveway. It was an older dark blue sedan covered with a thin layer of dust from the county roads. The driver stepped out carefully, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked as though it had traveled through decades of meetings. I recognized him immediately. "Walter?" I called. The older man smiled warmly. "Good morning, Harold." Walter Gaines had practiced real estate and estate law in Madison County for more than 40 years. He had drafted the paperwork when Margaret and I refinanced the ranch decades earlier. He had also helped us prepare our wills after Emily graduated from college. Around town, people respected him because he listened more than he spoke. He shook my hand firmly before turning toward the others. Daniel introduced himself politely. Walter nodded. Then his eyes settled on Emily. "It has been a long time," he said. "The last time I saw you, you were helping your mother plant maple trees near the house." Emily forced a smile. "It has been a while." Walter glanced at Jason and offered a courteous handshake before placing his briefcase on the porch table. "Harold called me early this morning." He sounded concerned. Jason immediately answered, "This is just a misunderstanding. We were trying to help Harold prepare for the future." Walter opened his briefcase without responding. He removed several neatly organized folders tied with blue ribbons. "Perhaps," he said calmly, "the documents will tell us more than opinions can." His quiet confidence changed the atmosphere completely. Jason shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Emily folded her arms tightly across her chest. Walter adjusted his reading glasses and carefully compared the document Daniel had received with copies from his own records. He took his time. He measured signatures. He compared dates. He examined seals and notary information one page at a time. No one interrupted him. Even the breeze seemed to slow while we waited. Finally, Walter removed his glasses and looked directly at me. "Harold, do you still have the original trust instructions Margaret insisted we prepare after her illness?" I nodded slowly. "They are in my safe inside the house." Walter smiled gently. "I remember the afternoon we signed them. Margaret was very determined." A memory returned so vividly that for a moment I could almost hear my wife's voice. She had sat beside me in Walter's office, resting one hand on mine. "Promise me one thing," she had said. "No matter what happens after I am gone, make decisions because they are right, not because someone pressures you." At the time, I thought she was simply worrying about the future. Now her words carried a different weight. Walter turned toward Emily. "Did your father ever discuss those trust instructions with you?" Emily hesitated. "Not in detail." "Interesting," Walter replied quietly. "Because those instructions contain a provision that would have required his direct participation in any transfer of ownership involving the ranch." Jason quickly spoke up. "Maybe Harold planned to update those documents." Walter looked at him with remarkable patience. "Legal documents are not updated through assumptions." Daniel remained silent, allowing Walter to continue. The attorney picked up the disputed power of attorney and placed it beside an authentic document from years earlier. "There are similarities," he observed, "enough to convince someone unfamiliar with Harold's handwriting." He paused before gently tapping one particular line with his finger. "But Harold always writes the month before the day." Margaret insisted on that habit because she disliked numerical confusion. This document reverses that order. Emily stared at the page without speaking. Walter continued in the same calm tone. "Small habits often reveal large truths." Jason frowned. "Surely a date format cannot decide everything." Walter looked directly at him. "No, but experience can." He slowly closed the folder and folded his hands together. "I have represented Harold Whitmore and his family for many years. I have watched him sign hundreds of documents. I have watched Margaret correct his spelling when he rushed through paperwork. I have watched them build this ranch one decision at a time. Some things cannot be copied simply by looking at a signature." Daniel quietly nodded. "That was my concern as well." Walter then turned back to me. "Harold, I believe we should proceed carefully, say very little, gather every fact. Let the document speak before emotions do." His advice settled over me like solid ground beneath uncertain feet. Across the table, Emily lowered her eyes for the first time since arriving. Jason opened his mouth as though preparing another explanation, but no words came. The confidence they had carried onto the property was beginning to disappear, replaced by the realization that they were no longer dealing with an aging rancher they assumed would simply trust whatever they placed in front of him. They were now facing people who knew the history of that land, the law that protected it, and the promises that had been written long before anyone imagined this morning would ever come. Walter remained on the porch long after the conversation slowed. He gathered the documents with the same careful hands that had handled my family's legal papers for decades, then looked toward the distant hills where the morning light was finally washing over the grass. "Harold," he said quietly, "there are moments when speaking too soon only helps the wrong people. This is not one of those moments. This is a moment for patience." I nodded. Patience had never been difficult for a rancher. Cattle did not hurry because a man wished they would. Crops ignored deadlines. Winter always arrived on its own schedule. Yet this kind of patience felt different. It required watching people I loved continue pretending while I slowly learned how much they had already hidden from me. Emily broke the silence first. "Dad, I think everybody is overreacting." Her voice carried none of the confidence she had worn earlier that morning. "There has to be a simple explanation." Walter looked at her with kindness rather than judgment. "Then the truth will support that explanation." Jason folded his arms. "Are we really going to drag lawyers into a family misunderstanding?" Walter answered before I could speak. "The law is often invited only after trust has already left the room." Jason looked away. Daniel quietly closed his folder. "I came here hoping someone would tell me everything was legitimate. Instead, I have more questions than answers." No one argued with him. After a few more minutes, Walter prepared to leave. Before stepping toward his car, he turned back to me. "Bring the original trust documents to my office tomorrow morning. Every page, every amendment. There is something I want to verify." I raised an eyebrow. "You sound as though you already suspect something." A faint smile crossed his face. "I remember conversations other people have forgotten." Then he drove away, leaving behind another sentence I could not stop thinking about. Daniel remained only long enough to shake my hand again. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Whitmore." "You appreciated it before you even knew me," I replied. "That is why you made the phone call." He smiled. "My father always told me that if a deal depends on avoiding one conversation, it probably is not the right deal." I watched his truck disappear down the gravel road. The ranch grew quiet again, but it was not the peaceful quiet I had known for years. It was the kind of silence that waits for the next storm. Emily lingered near the porch steps while Jason walked toward his truck, pretending to inspect his phone. She looked older than she had the day before. "Dad," she said softly, "can we talk alone?" I studied her face. For a brief moment, I saw the little girl who used to run through the fields chasing butterflies with her mother. Then that image faded beneath years of choices neither of us could undo. "Of course," I answered. Jason immediately spoke from the driveway. "Emily, we should get going." She ignored him. "Dad, you know I only wanted what was best." I asked a simple question. "Did you ever once ask me what I believed was best?" She lowered her eyes. The answer did not come. Instead, she whispered, "You have been alone for so long." "Being alone is not the same as being incapable," I replied gently. "There is a difference." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "Jason says you carry too much responsibility." I looked toward the barns. Responsibility is not something another person decides you are no longer worthy of carrying. Jason called again, louder this time. Emily finally walked away without another word. I stood on the porch until their truck disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees lining the county road. Only then did I return inside the farmhouse. Margaret's photograph rested exactly where it always had, beside the stone fireplace. I picked it up and smiled sadly. "You always understood people better than I did," I murmured. My eyes drifted toward the old bookshelf where a weathered leather binder rested behind several family albums. Most visitors never noticed it because it looked ordinary. That was intentional. Margaret insisted years earlier that important things should never appear important. I opened the binder slowly. Inside were copies of Fitz, Rents, Inner, the Retson letters, land surveys, and one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Margaret's careful handwriting. I had never opened it because she told me there would come a day when I would know exactly when it was time. For years that instruction had seemed mysterious. Now I found myself holding the envelope longer than ever before. Yet I still did not break the seal. Something told me Walter remembered its existence for a reason. Something else told me Margaret had anticipated difficulties long before I ever imagined them. My thoughts were interrupted by another sound outside. It was old Ben Carter from the neighboring ranch riding over in his utility vehicle. Ben was 78, a retired county commissioner and a lifelong friend who had known Margaret almost as long as I had. He climbed onto the porch carrying a small toolbox. "Thought you might need this wrench you loaned me," he said with an easy smile. Then he noticed my expression. "Something happened." I did not answer directly. "Ben, have you ever felt like everyone around you knew a conversation was taking place except you?" He sat beside me without hesitation. "Once," he said. "Many years ago. We remained quiet for a while before." He added, "Harold, people around this county still speak about what you and Margaret built. They do not see only fences and cattle. They see a family that kept its word when others sold out. Reputation takes a lifetime to grow." I looked at him. "Sometimes I wonder if I deserve that reputation." Ben chuckled softly. "You earned it every time you helped a neighbor before helping yourself." His words settled somewhere deep inside me. It reminded me that my story was larger than the misunderstanding unfolding inside my own family. There were people whose lives had crossed mine long before Emily met Jason. People who remembered promises I had made and promises I had kept. They knew parts of my life my daughter had never fully understood. As Ben stood to leave, he placed one hand on my shoulder. "Do not forget who you are just because somebody else forgot." After he drove away, I looked once more at the sealed envelope resting on the kitchen table. I still did not open it. But for the first time, I began to understand that Margaret had left behind far more than memories. She had left behind a plan, and somehow only a handful of people still knew it existed. The following morning, I drove into the county seat before sunrise with Walter's folders resting on the passenger seat beside Margaret's sealed envelope. The roads were quiet, the kind of quiet that lets a man hear his own thoughts more clearly than he sometimes wishes. Every fence post and pasture I passed reminded me that land never chooses sides. It simply remembers who cared for it. Walter was already waiting when I arrived at his office. A fresh pot of coffee sat on the table between us, untouched. "You brought everything?" he asked. I nodded and placed the documents in front of him. He carefully opened the trust file first, then looked at Margaret's unopened envelope. "You still have not read it." "She told me I would know when the time was right," I answered. Walter smiled gently. "Margaret always trusted your judgment." He reviewed each page with remarkable patience. Occasionally, he compared an old signature with one from another year, then another. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Harold, nothing here authorizes anyone to transfer ownership without your direct written approval witnessed under very specific conditions. Those conditions have never been met." I felt neither relief nor triumph, only sadness. Then all of this could have been avoided if someone had simply spoken honestly. Walter folded his hands. "Most painful family disputes begin long before legal documents ever appear." Before we could continue, Daniel arrived carrying his own folder. He greeted both of us politely. "I contacted the title company this morning," he said. "They agreed to suspend everything until ownership questions are resolved." Walter nodded with quiet approval. That was the responsible decision. Daniel hesitated before adding, "Mr. Whitmore, I also received several messages from Jason late last night asking why I had stopped returning his calls." I looked toward the window. "Did you answer him?" "No," Daniel replied. "I believed it would be better if we all spoke together." Less than an hour later, Jason and Emily walked into Walter's office without being invited. Their expressions revealed they already sensed something had changed. Jason tried to sound confident. "Walter, surely we can clear this up in a few minutes." Walter motioned toward the conference table. "Please have a seat." Emily looked at me. "Dad, why did you not call me first?" I answered calmly. "Because I wanted to understand the facts before discussing feelings." She lowered her eyes. Jason immediately stepped in. "There has been a misunderstanding about paperwork. We were only trying to help Harold simplify his estate planning." Walter quietly slid several documents across the table. "Then perhaps you can explain these." Jason glanced at the pages, then looked away almost immediately. "Those are preliminary drafts." Daniel spoke for the first time. "The copy I received described them as final." Jason's voice grew tighter. "Someone must have sent the wrong version." Emily reached for his arm. "Jason." He gently pulled away and continued speaking. "This entire thing has become exaggerated." I remained silent. Walter turned toward Emily instead. "Did your father ever personally instruct you to negotiate the sale of his ranch?" She hesitated long enough that the silence itself became an answer. He He wanted to think about the future. Walter repeated the question with the same calm voice. Did he authorize you to negotiate a sale? Emily swallowed. Not directly. No one raised a voice. No one accused anyone of anything. The truth was slowly finding its own place in the room. Jason leaned forward. Harold was overwhelmed. We believed we were acting in his best interest. I finally spoke. Did either of you ever ask me what my best interest was? Neither answered. I continued quietly. You both decided what my future should be before I was invited into the conversation. Emily looked as though she wanted to speak, but tears gathered before words could. Jason tried once more. We thought you would eventually agree. Then why was I never asked first? I replied. Again, there was no answer. Daniel slowly placed the disputed power of attorney beside one of my authentic signatures. This document is the reason I made that phone call. Walter nodded. And that call prevented a mistake from becoming something much more serious. Emily looked at Daniel with disbelief. You called my father? Yes, he answered simply. Because buying land means trusting the people involved. I wanted to hear the owner's voice. She covered her face with one hand for a moment before whispering, everything happened so fast. I looked at my daughter with more sorrow than anger. No, Emily. It happened slowly, one small decision at a time. Walter quietly closed the folders. There will be time later to discuss intentions. Today we only need to establish the facts. Jason stood abruptly and began pacing near the window. So now everybody thinks I planned this? His frustration filled the room, but no one responded with the same emotion. I looked at him steadily. I am not here to decide what was in your heart. I am only describing what happened. He stopped walking. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing prepared to say. Emily finally looked directly at me. Dad, are you ever going to forgive me? I answered honestly. Forgiveness begins with truth. We have only just started telling it. The room fell silent once more. Outside the office window, people continued walking along Main Street as though it were an ordinary morning. Inside, however, something had quietly shifted. No one had won. No one had been humiliated, but the weight of assumptions, excuses, and half-spoken stories had begun to give way to something stronger. Facts. And once facts are spoken calmly, they become very difficult to push back into silence. The meeting ended without raised voices. Walter gathered the folders one by one. Daniel shook my hand, and people quietly stepped into the hallway. I remained seated for another minute, watching sunlight spill across the polished wooden table. There was something strangely peaceful about the room now. The truth had not solved everything, but it had finally entered the conversation. As I stepped outside, I noticed Emily and Jason standing beside their truck in the parking lot. They believed no one could hear them. I had no intention of listening, but the wind carried their voices across the empty spaces between us. You told me everything had been handled, Emily said, her voice trembling. Jason answered immediately, because it should have been. Nobody could have predicted Daniel would start making personal phone calls. Emily shook her head. You said my father would never question anything. He never did before, Jason replied. How was I supposed to know he suddenly had half the county looking at paperwork? I stopped beside my own truck without saying a word. Their conversation was no longer about me. It had become about each other. Do not put this on me, Emily said. You were the one who kept saying the ranch was wasted on one old man. Jason threw his hands into the air. Because you agreed with me. She stared at him in disbelief. I agreed we should help him. I never agreed to make him feel like he did not matter. Jason laughed bitterly. Now you want to rewrite history? No, Emily answered quietly. I want to remember it honestly. I looked away. It is a difficult thing to witness people discovering that the story they have been telling themselves no longer fits the facts. I drove back to the ranch alone. The familiar roads seemed different somehow, not because the landscape had changed, but because I finally understood how many quiet conversations had taken place without me over the past 2 years. Yet, instead of anger, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. Margaret used to say that disappointment hurts most when it removes an illusion we desperately wanted to keep. I finally understood what she meant. That afternoon, Ben Carter stopped by again, carrying 2 sandwiches from the diner in town. Thought you might forget to eat, he said with a grin. We sat beneath the old cottonwood tree overlooking the west pasture. Neither of us spoke much at first. Good friends rarely need to fill silence. Eventually, Ben looked toward the cattle grazing peacefully across the field. You know, he said. I have seen neighbors lose farms because of drought, floods, and bad markets. I have never seen anyone almost lose one because people stopped talking honestly. I smiled faintly. Neither have I. Before long, another truck rolled into the driveway. It was Daniel. He climbed out carrying another folder. I thought you should know, he said. The title company completed its internal review. He handed me a letter confirming that every transfer had been formally suspended pending verification of ownership. No further action can happen without your direct involvement, he explained. I wanted you to hear that from me instead of through rumors. Thank you, I said sincerely. Ben read the expression on my face before I spoke another word. Good news? The ranch is exactly where it has always been, I answered. Ben smiled. Sometimes that is the best kind of news. As the afternoon faded into evening, my phone rang several times. I did not answer immediately. Eventually, I saw another message from Emily. It simply read, Dad, please let me explain. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one came from Jason. We need to get our stories straight before people start talking. I stared at those words for a long moment. One message asked for a conversation. The other worried about appearances. They revealed more than either of them probably intended. I put the phone back into my pocket without replying. Later that evening, Walter called. Harold, he said, I wanted you to know something. Go ahead. I received 2 separate calls this afternoon. From whom? First Jason, then Emily. They each wanted to explain the situation. I waited quietly. Walter continued. What struck me was that neither explanation matched the other. I closed my eyes. I suspected as much. People often discover the truth about themselves when pressure arrives, Walter said. Sometimes they stand together. Sometimes they begin protecting only themselves. We spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I walked alone toward the old red barn. The evening air carried the scent of fresh hay, and swallows circled beneath the roof exactly as they had every summer for decades. Nothing in nature seemed interested in human pride. The horses still waited for feed. The cattle still gathered near the water. The sun still disappeared behind the distant hills with quiet dignity. Standing there, I realized I had spent far too much of my life believing I needed to defeat someone in order to protect what mattered. But the past 2 days had taught me something different. I had not exposed anyone. I had not shouted. I had not demanded revenge. I had simply answered questions honestly whenever they were asked. Everything else had unfolded on its own. As darkness settled over the ranch, another vehicle slowly entered the driveway. This time, it was only Emily. She stepped out alone. Jason was nowhere to be seen. She remained beside her car for several seconds before walking toward the porch with uncertain steps. Her eyes were red from crying, and in her hand she carried a thick manila envelope. When she reached me, she held it out without saying a word. I looked down at it. Across the front, written in Jason's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words that changed everything I thought I knew about how long this plan had truly been unfolding. Property Transition Strategy Draft. Emily stood quietly on the porch, holding the thick envelope with both hands as though it weighed far more than paper should. The evening breeze lifted a few strands of her hair across her face, but she made no attempt to move them. She simply looked at me with tired eyes. I found this in Jason's office, she said softly. I did not know it existed until today. I accepted the envelope without opening it immediately. There had been a time when I would have rushed to discover every answer at once. Age had taught me something different. The truth does not become more truthful because it is opened in a hurry. Come inside, I said. She hesitated. Are you sure? I nodded. This has always been your home, Emily. She lowered her head, and for the first time in days, I saw my daughter instead of the stranger who had been standing across conference tables and legal documents. We sat at the old kitchen table where Margaret had served thousands of meals over the years. Nothing in that room had changed. The same oak cabinets. The same faded curtains Margaret sewed herself. The same small crack in the corner of the window that had survived 3 decades of Montana winters. Emily slowly looked around the kitchen. Everything is exactly the same. I smiled gently. Not everything. She understood what I meant. I finally opened the envelope. Inside were business plans, financial projections, handwritten notes, and several pages describing long-term development ideas for the property. Some pages discussed luxury vacation cabins. Others proposed dividing grazing land into residential lots. None of the documents mentioned the cattle. None mentioned preserving the ranch. None mentioned family history. They described acreage, investment returns, infrastructure costs, and projected profits. I quietly closed the folder again. Emily stared at it without speaking. "Did you know?" I asked. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Jason always told me those were only ideas for someday if you decided to retire." She covered her face with both hands. I wanted to believe him because I thought we were building a better future. I reached across the table and gently rested my hand over hers. Sometimes people convince themselves that the destination matters so much they stop paying attention to the road they are taking. She looked at me through her tears. "Can you ever trust me again?" I answered honestly because anything less would have been unfair. Trust grows the same way crops do. It cannot be demanded. It must be planted again, cared for every day, and given time. She nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of cattle moving toward the north pasture as the evening cooled. The ranch continued living its ordinary life while ours slowly found its way back toward honesty. The following morning, I walked the property alone before sunrise. Dew covered the grass, and each step reminded me how many mornings Margaret and I had greeted together. I stopped beside the maple tree we planted on our 25th wedding anniversary. It had grown tall enough to cast a broad circle of shade over the yard. Margaret used to joke that trees never argue about who owns the land because they understand they only borrow it for a little while. Standing beneath its branches, I finally understood what she had been trying to teach me all those years. Ownership was never the most important part of stewardship. Character was. Later that day, Ben Carter arrived with a thermos of coffee. He noticed the peaceful expression on my face before saying a word. "Looks like something changed." I poured us each a cup. "It did. Did everything work out?" he asked. I looked across the pasture where a group of calves followed their mothers through the morning light. "Not everything." He waited patiently. "But enough." Ben smiled knowingly. "That sounds more valuable than winning." I laughed softly. "It is." We spent the next hour repairing an old section of fence that had weathered another hard winter. Neither of us mentioned legal documents. Neither of us mentioned Jason. Instead, we talked about rainfall, calves, grandchildren, and the changing seasons. I realized that healing often arrives quietly while people are busy doing ordinary work together. A week later, Daniel returned to the ranch, not as a prospective buyer, but simply as a visitor. He brought homemade pie baked by his wife and insisted we share it on the porch. "I figured this place deserved better memories than paperwork," he said with a grin. We laughed together. During the afternoon, he helped repair a gate that had been sticking for months. Before leaving, he looked across the valley and said, "I almost bought this ranch because I admired the land. Now I admire something else." I raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "The way you protected your family without forgetting they were still your family." His words stayed with me long after he drove away. I was not certain I deserved such praise, but I knew what I wanted the future to become. I no longer wanted every conversation to revolve around what had gone wrong. I wanted to spend whatever years remained teaching younger people why this place mattered beyond dollars and deeds. A few evenings later, Emily returned once more. This time, she came alone carrying work gloves instead of paperwork. She looked at me with quiet determination. "Is there anything that needs fixing?" she asked. I smiled toward the old fence running along the east pasture. "There is always something that needs fixing on a ranch." She smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. We walked toward the fence together beneath a sky turning gold with the setting sun. Neither of us spoke about mistakes. Neither of us pretended the past had disappeared. We simply carried tools side by side, taking the first small steps toward rebuilding something far more valuable than a piece of property. We were learning, one quiet afternoon at a time, that the strongest inheritance a family can leave behind is not land. It is the willingness to return to one another with honesty when pride finally grows tired of carrying the weight of silence. Nearly a year passed before I realized I had stopped looking over my shoulder. Healing does not arrive with a single conversation. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed, until one ordinary morning you discover that peace has replaced the weight you carried for so long. Spring returned to Madison County just as it always had. The snow melted into the creeks. Fresh grass covered the hills. Calves wandered beside their mothers across the same pastures Margaret and I had watched together for decades. The ranch had survived another winter, and somehow, so had I. The legal questions eventually found their proper conclusions through ordinary procedures. The transfer never happened. The property remained exactly where it belonged. Daniel withdrew from the purchase with dignity, and before long he became something far more valuable than a business acquaintance. He became a friend. Every few weeks he and his wife visited the ranch, bringing homemade pie, sharing stories, and reminding me that good people still choose integrity even when no one is watching. Walter helped me establish a family trust exactly as Margaret had once hoped. Every page reflected one simple principle: stewardship would always matter more than ownership. The ranch would never again depend upon assumptions or silence. It would be protected by clarity, responsibility, and honest conversation. When I signed the final documents, Walter smiled and said, "Now this land has the future your wife always imagined." I looked out the office window and quietly answered, "She was still taking care of us after all these years." Emily's journey took longer. Trust cannot be repaired with apologies alone. She accepted that. She never asked me to forget. Instead, she began showing up every Saturday morning wearing old work boots and faded blue jeans. Sometimes we repaired fences, sometimes we cleaned equipment, sometimes we simply shared coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise without speaking very much. One afternoon, she stopped working, leaned against the fence, and looked across the valley. "Dad," she said, "I spent so much time worrying about what this place was worth that I forgot why it was priceless." I smiled gently. "That realization is worth more than any acreage." She nodded with tears in her eyes. "I wish I had understood sooner." "So do I answered honestly. But understanding still arrived. Jason moved away before the following winter. I heard through neighbors that he accepted another position several states away. I wished him no harm. Life has its own way of teaching lessons that no courtroom or argument ever could. Reputation is built quietly over many years, and it changes just as quietly when people lose confidence. I never celebrated his departure because peace never grows from another person's downfall. It grows from finally releasing the burden of carrying bitterness. Ben Carter remained one of my closest friends. Together, we started inviting local high school students to spend weekends learning practical ranch work. They repaired gates, cared for livestock, learned how to mend fences, and discovered that responsibility begins with showing up before sunrise. Watching those young men and women laugh while working reminded me that every generation deserves someone willing to teach instead of simply criticize. One Saturday afternoon, a young boy asked me, "Mr. Whitmore, how do you know when a ranch really belongs to somebody?" I looked across the fields before answering. "When they care for it even on the days nobody is watching." He smiled thoughtfully and returned to his work. I believe he understood. As for me, I no longer measured my life by the painful days that almost changed everything. I measured it by the ordinary mornings that quietly restored what mattered most. I often found myself sitting beneath the maple tree Margaret and I planted years earlier. It had grown taller than the house now, its branches stretching wide enough to shade almost the entire front yard. I finally opened the sealed letter she had left for me. Her handwriting was as steady and familiar as I remembered. She wrote only a few simple sentences. "Harold, if you are reading this, life has probably become more complicated than either of us hoped. Remember that land can feed a family, but only love and truth can keep one together. Protect both with equal courage." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Then I smiled through quiet tears, not because I missed her any less, but because I finally understood every lesson she had spent a lifetime trying to teach me. If you have listened to my story and recognized pieces of your own life in it, I hope you remember this. Do not allow anyone else to define your worth simply because you have grown older. Your experience still matters. Your voice still matters. Your boundaries still matter. Kindness does not require surrendering your judgment, and forgiveness does not require abandoning your self-respect. The people who truly love you will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. If this story stayed with you, I would be grateful if you chose to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. I would especially love to hear what lesson spoke most deeply to your heart because someone else reading your words may find the encouragement they need today. The lesson I carried away from this chapter of my life is simple. Protect what gives your life meaning before someone else decides its price for you. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing this journey to become part of yours. I hope these moments reminded you that even after disappointment, there is still room for trust, quiet strength, and new beginnings. Until we meet again in another story, may your heart remain steady, your home remain filled with peace, and may you never forget that the richest inheritance we leave behind is not what we own, but the character we choose to pass on. As the sun disappeared beyond the Montana hills that evening, I hung Margaret's old barn key back on the small wooden hook beside the front door where it had rested for decades. It was only an old key, worn smooth by countless seasons, yet somehow it reminded me that the strongest doors are never protected by locks alone. They are protected by the hearts of the people who choose, every single day, to honor what is waiting on the other side.